Hi, this is Richard Dunn from Evoker. In this video we're going to look at this last effect, which is a very simple magic spell kind of effect. Now we're referring to this green ball at the end of this room. These are the fires that we've already made, and most of the effects that are used in this spell are used in this fire. They're just being used in a different way. What we want to see is some magic effects made that are unique and utilize some of the skills that you've learnt making the fire and the rain and the snow. Let's take a look at this spell in closer detail. As you can see, it's made up of 4 components. We have a ball, and there's actually a static mesh ball. It's not a particle effect as such. It's actually a mesh with a special material scrolling around on the surface of the ball. We're going to provide this effect to you so that you can have a look at it and pull it apart. The second part of this effect is the smoke. This is very similar to the way we did the smoke for the torch, but it utilizes another technique called flow maps. Now, creating flow maps is beyond the scope of this video, but we're going to provide you with a couple of different flow maps that you can use. You'll see how they're hooked up in the material for the smoke, and I'll go over that soon. And if we go out of this into editor mode, we can see the third component is just a light, and that light is exactly the same as the light we created for the fire, but instead of a simple panning noise, it's using a variation of what's on the ball without all the color information. It's basically what's on the ball turned into grayscale and applied to the light, so that what is happening on the wall with the light is the same as what would be cast from this orb. So what we'll do now is we'll go in and we'll have a look at the actual components of this shader. The shader for the smoke and the shader for the orb. This sort of effect is largely driven by the material more than the particle effect, which is typical for most complicated particles. So here we are in the content browser, and here's our particle magic. So if we open that up, we can see it here. What we're going to do is we're just going to turn off the geometry so we can see it. So this particle is comprised of 3 emitters. We have one for the green smoke that you can see in here, and we have one for the yellow smoke. So we have yellow, green, and we also have the ball. Now this is not a particle, not in any way. It's actually a static mesh or a ball, and it has a material on it that's just panning over the surface. And what we're doing is we're controlling the animation of this ball with the initial mesh rotation. So through here we can actually control the speed, like that. Now the intensity of this ball is controlled by how many of them we're spawning. If we come up here and we spawn 20, as you can see it just turns into a green mass. If we go down too low, we start to see flickering from the pattern repeating itself. It's like an oscillation error, it's out of sync with itself. So you need to find a balance. Go to about 6 or 7. Now there is color over life and alpha over life, just like we did with the fire. If we come in here and we graph it, we can see that the alpha over life starts at full strength and it gradually goes transparent. With the color, it's been made green, value 1. and this is telling us that all values are at 1. Now our initial size for this mesh is controlling the scale of the sphere. Now there's no reason that this has to be kept as a sphere. We could get some really interesting effects if we were to make that 3. You see we now have an ellipse or a cocoon kind of shaped object. We could also expand that to another direction. Now it looks strange, but I'm sure there could be reasons why you would want to do this for something. So we'll set these back to 1. Let's try putting that in -10 and putting that one to 10. As you can see, you know, there's really limitless things that you can do just by experimenting with the numbers. So that's what we're going to say about the ball. That's about where we're going to end that. It's just an example of how you can use shapes and meshes. So what we'll do now is we'll talk about the material on this ball before we proceed to talk about the smokes. So if we come into the content browser and we see we have matte light orb. Okay, so if we look at the material for this orb, what we have is we have a noise texture where we're using the alpha channel or the image that's stored in the alpha channel. That's then been panned and moved across the surface in a direction, and that's hooked up to a texture coordinate to control the tiling. We then have another panner and another texture coordinate set to another direction, and we're adding those two vectors together to give us a random moving image. We're then plugging that in to modify the UVs of another texture here, which is then being multiplied by a color, or a green in this case. So this green is what we're seeing in here. The second one is exactly the same thing down here with slightly different values to make it look different, and a different shade of green. What we've then done is we've created a linear interpolate. This is a node that allows you to place two different materials on top of one another and defining which one is visible and where by the alpha. The alpha can be either a number in this case, or it can be an image. What we've got here is a little function that's called a dot product. This node, the dot product, the camera vector, and the constant 3 must always be used together like this. What it does is it creates this fall off around the edge of the orb. It's the same sort of effect as what you would see in a Fresnel, where the surfaces that are 90 degrees to the screen or your eyes appear invisible, and they soften off dependent on how close they get to being parallel with your eyes. We've then run it through a power and a constant. These two act as though a levels in Photoshop or a curves. How much black and white of the image is being used and the ratio of which. So that's what these functions here do. And then all we've done is we've put it through a multiply and a number. This is essentially brightness. And then we've put it and multiplied it through a mesh emit vertex color. And this is what will enable us to color the orb in the particle editor. So we're going to give you this material, and hopefully you can pull it to pieces and try and come up with something a bit interesting with it or add to it. All these techniques were used in the fire. If you remember, in the fire we distorted the UVs with some noise textures. This is exactly the same thing that's going on here. So this part's been used with the fire, multiplying it by a color. The only thing new here is the dot product, but this has to be used like this. So let's go back now to the particle editor and have a look at our smoke particles. Back in the particle editor, we have these two smoke particles here. Now they are identical. One was made and then a copy of that particle was made by selecting it, emitter, duplicate emitter, and then we renamed the duplicate to big. These are identical units. They're exactly the same, and then we've come in and we've changed the scale, color, life, etc. just to mix it up a bit. All the things that happen in this smoke are pretty much driven by the material again, very much like the smoke we did for the fire. And you'll notice the dynamic parameter, which is very, very similar to the one we used in the torch smoke to control the contrast, the amount of UV distortion that we're getting in it, etc. As you can see here, we have the same nodes almost, slightly different names, and they do slightly different things. So we'll get into that now. So we'll jump into the material editor and have a look at the smoke. Okay, so here we are, we're looking at the smoke material for this particle effect. What we have here is essentially the same thing we did for the fire and the smoke in the torch. What we've got is a vertex color so that we can color it, just like we did with the fire. We've multiplied that against a power and into contrast, exactly like we did with the smoke and the fire. Here what we've done is we've taken a flow map. Now the flow map is something a little bit new. This is exactly what the flow map looks like. It's a texture coordinate that has distortion already baked into it. These have to be created in a 3D application, which is beyond the scope of these videos. What's happened is then it's been put through a component mask to mask out the RG, or X and Y, and it's been fed into a lerp with another texture coordinate, and the alpha is multiplied against a control to make it random. Here what we've done is we've taken the output of that result into another texture sample of some smoke, and we've fed both values against white into a lerp, which will in turn act as though it's blurring out depending on the value that we give it. The best thing to do here is to jump in and actually have a look at what these parameters do to the smoke in the actual emitter. This system is the same for both kinds of smoke, it's just that we punch in different values into each of these parameters. The other thing that should be mentioned also is you'll notice we have a blend translucent and unlit lighting model, whereas the actual sphere if we look at that, is blend additive and unlit. So if we come back to this effect here, and let's turn off the ball, and let's just have a look at what these settings do. Let's isolate that and just look at the yellow. If we come down to the dynamic, these are all pretty self-explanatory and you should pretty much know what they do by now. But let's have a look at the dynamic, and let's just see what each one does. Contrast is going to just give us a slightly more wispy effect. So if we go to 1, we have a more opaque, dense fire. If we go to 2, it starts to get more wispy and more transparent. Obviously you can go too far with it. If we go to 5, it completely vanishes. If we go to 0.5, it's too much. It's just a case of finding the value that works. So that's the contrast. Let's now have a look at the blur control. Again, it's just a case of playing with these parameters, but in here if we put 2, it's very subtle and it is hard to see what's happening. But it's just changing the pattern slightly because it's multiplying the smoke pattern by white, and it's going to just create more or less detail effectively. Now if we come up to flow map randomization, this is going to give us some quite varied results. If we type in 1 or 2, it's a very similar result to blur, but it does a slightly different thing. It's just randomizing the patterns in the texture to make it less obvious that it's one texture. So that just about wraps up our explanation of the magic effect. So take these shaders, pull them apart, work out how they're working, and try and make something unique and come up with your own magic effect. Have fun.